I'm going to announce the next speaker now. Emma Harding has been working as a clinical psychologist for the past 7 years and previously worked in a service that supports people with mental health needs into employment. Emma is also a trustee of the McPinn Foundation, a charity that serves to promote and deliver high-quality mental health research and lived experience at its heart.
Thanks, Alicia. I'm aware I haven't given you a lot to go on there, but don't worry, I'm sure some more stuff will come out as we're going through the presentation. So I think one thing that's struck me through my career, I've worked in the same role pretty much for the past 7 years, but it's taken me from working in East Dulwich, in Peckham, to very, very different areas. I've seen a huge juxtaposition of different areas of kind of social and economic challenges kind of next to each other, which has really inspired me to think a lot about actually what we're doing as psychologists, how can psychology actually change to serve people a bit better. So I suppose one thing to say, my chosen tickle for today is Sprite for dream watchers. And I suppose one thing I should say is that I've just realised that 2 presentations have got slightly muddled up here, so this will be a bit of an interesting talk for all of us, really, going through this presentation to see where I'm at. Anyway, we shall embark as we go on. So I'm aware that I've chosen a rather provocative title, Where Are the Psychos in Psychology? And I have to say I do hate the casual use of pejorative language about psychological distress. But it's exactly this kind of thing, this kind of language that makes it difficult for us to talk about being psychologists and having our own mental health needs, having our own difficulties. And I suppose one thing to say about language because of that is I may use terms that you would not choose to use, and that's really because of the availability of the lexicon I have about the work that I do and the kind of situation I place myself in. Not really any wish to impose my mindset on you, and definitely not to offend, so please do take that genuinely. So I suppose today, what I wanted to do was take things back a bit of a step, taking a bit of a subversive approach actually, but as psychologists, I guess we're all a bit used to taking a kind of unique soul stance in a lot of mental health services, holding our position against some of the challenges of other models that may be prevailing. And I wanted to think a bit about who are psychologists and what more can the profession do to make ourselves and our society more caring. But that is going to involve talking a little bit about what goes on in the therapy room, but also a little bit about what pointedly does not go on in the therapy room and how, if we did a bit more of it, it could be quite helpful. And I suppose my main point is that people with their own experience of mental health issues are actually visibly kind of underrepresented in mental health and professions, in clinical psychology particularly. But people do this work for a reason, we join for personal reasons. Many of us have our own kind of difficulties that we want to kind of use positively. Jung talks about the wounded healer, so the idea that we may be kind of compelled to heal because we ourselves are suffering. And I think that's really true of everybody, but it goes into a profession where we're helping other people. There may be something about ourselves that it's also helping to heal. I suppose I was really kind of buoyed this morning by Jamie's kind of humble outing of himself as using lithium for the past 20 years. And I guess in a way it might make my talk the kind of most quickly outdated talk in the history of presentation. But actually, I do suspect that many of us have at times struggled with ideas about owning our identity in different situations. Those of us that have had mental health issues that struggle with them might have had questions about how to come out, how to talk about it, and actually what will the impact be if I do. So really, that's the position I'm coming from. And I suppose that doesn't mean I have to out myself as kind of having my own experience of mental health issues. I had a massive psychosis when I was studying my undergraduate degree, and it really influenced my choice of profession and made me really want to work in this particular area. But I think it's quite a powerful message that if those of us in a relatively powerful position within the service, the health service, the system, are not really able to be visibly representative or even own our own distress, it sends out a bit of a hypocritical message and makes it very difficult for other people to feel able and confident to talk about their own difficulties, which is really what we're aiming to do as psychologists, help people to talk about things, help people to make changes and help the world to be a more caring, loving place. So a tiny bit about me. I have chosen an old photo here, so kind of vanity's a bit on the problem there. So I did a psychology degree, had my first symptoms of psychosis, went into hospital, started working in an employment project, and then started doing lots of media and campaigning work. I was always told I'd never get on clinical psychology training. I'd had my own personal experience, so it wasn't ever going to happen for me. So I kind of gave up on that and started doing more kind of activist-based campaigning work. And through that I built up confidence and contacts and experience. And one day I managed to actually get on clinical training. And in 2008 I started employment at South London and Maudsley. So I guess I've kind of covered that already. But just thinking about, quick straw poll actually. Who in here has had a mental health problem? So a few hands going up. How many people feel confident to talk about that at work? Many fewer hands, but some very, very vigorous ones at the back, which I'm pleased to hear about. And I think it's an important issue for us to think about actually. You know, we have these very powerful, profound experiences, but if we can't talk about them in ways that are helpful to us and other people, where does that leave our position? And thinking about society, quite often there are things that society does that Dave talked in very fine detail about, and we're grateful to him for plugging up so much. So the idea that social problems are often located in the individual, things that we experience. So there is an argument that mental illness is where poverty and distress and challenges are kind of labelled as, and the distress that results are labelled as mental illness in an individual. So all the problems that can result from tribalism, from social expectations, class, poverty, all conspire to lead to distress. And labelling this as mental illness is highly stigmatising. Society has a great influence on individuals, and going along with the crowd or being different can be a highly distressing social threat. So how can individuals influence society, and how can society actually help? Well, we do have to start somewhere, but some of the greats have led the way. So arguably making society more caring. So for example, Mandela's rejection of anger is genuine, but also psychologically a powerful intervention that ended in dismantling apartheid. So thinking about the benefits of disclosure, when we talk about it in therapy, 90% of therapists do it at least occasionally, but it is listed as one of the least frequent things that we use in therapy. Kathy Sharmas talks about qualitative research, which a lot of psychologists engage in because of the importance it gives to lived experience and people's own explanations. And importance of actually positioning ourselves and locating our identity and our influence on the process and relationship with the population of people that we're working with. And I guess with that in mind, as a psychologist and as a service user, I used to think of myself as an activist, a rights campaigner, but also I defected and became a clinician, so I kind of fall between two stools on that one, very much caught between two separate worlds. And I think there's an idea that actually, is it possible for us to ever avoid disclosure? The idea that actually whatever we wear, our expressions, the questions we ask, the way we help the room is set up, the assumptions we make about the individuals, all indicate to people something about ourselves and our preconceptions about that particular situation. Can everybody hear okay? I'm struggling to kind of breathe, so I'll take a bit of a pause. I've talked about the Johari window a little bit there, so the idea that there are things that we notice that other people don't notice, that other people notice about us that we don't notice, things that both of us notice in a situation, and things that neither of us notice. So quite often we can't always guarantee we know what other people are picking up about us. And actually there are very different types of disclosure. Facts about ourselves, feelings, insights about problems, strategies to use to resolve them, reassurance and support, and challenge and immediacy. So Knox and Hill write about this idea of immediacy, so the actual thoughts and feelings that are going through our heads in the room with a particular individual when we're working with somebody that we're trying to offer therapy to. And all of these things are giving away stuff about us. And I think if we're more in touch and more comfortable with talking about and accepting our own identity, for those of us with our own experience of mental health issues, it can make it a much more pleasant experience for everybody and a lot more therapeutic and a lot more kind of natural. So when is disclosure commonly used? At the beginning of a therapeutic relationship, quite often people will ask for biographical kind of qualifications and information about us to help heal a rift in a relationship. So we quite often might inject a bit of personal information to make things feel a bit more intimate again. At the end of a relationship, the therapist might self-disclose, and this could be particularly effective. So Knox and Hill kind of particularly encourage this idea. And Knox and Hill actually wrote some guidelines about disclosure, but they don't really unpack what they mean by what they recommend most often, which which is appropriate disclosure. So it's very difficult to know actually what they mean by that. One thing that's really relevant for me right now is the fact that I'm pregnant, and so it's going to be sparking off questions about my relationships and my life with people that I'm working with, and actually it's a very big part of my life, and it's going to mean that people are going to make assumptions and come to understandings about me that I may not have any control over. So in some settings, disclosure is actually seen as a professional qualification. So belonging to a particular group, so working with domestic violence, with LGBT people, individuals, working in HIV/AIDS services, all these particular areas might require people to disclose their own particular status. And I think CBT initially started off with not really wanting to kind of own a lot of information about the therapeutic relationship or to have a lot of kind of thought about it. But a lot of the techniques it uses, normalising, modelling and reinforcement, rely on having a little bit of information about the individual kind of being shared with from the therapist to the individual. In DBT, dialectical behaviour therapy, includes a lot of immediacy disclosures, so people actually talking about how things are in the room for that moment. So as I mentioned, guidelines talking about appropriate disclosure have been written, but also one thing we can't guard against is the internet, so people finding out lots of information about us before we get into a room with them. But actually we often have a lot of information about service users before they get in a room with us, so it's kind of quite nice to address that balance and have that sense that somebody else might know things about us that we don't. It can be very difficult to reveal information about ourselves in supervision even to supervisors, people we feel might be judging us or might be responsible for passing us through a course. So actually if it's difficult in that particular context, when we're relatively protected and safe, how difficult is it going to be working with a service user to be able to use our information and our kind of own insights therapeutically? The idea of social penetration theory talks about that we can't really come to understand somebody unless we make ourselves vulnerable with them, and that can often be about kind of disclosing information about our own kind of use of services. I should be very clear that I don't advocate huge personal disclosures about all of our massive difficulties in mental health services ourselves. I mean, I went to a GP once about painful foot, and she spent a long time telling me about her divorce, and I found that a really unpleasant experience. So I don't think it's something we should be kind of like cavalierly rushing around telling everybody about all of this kind of deep, dark, intimate secrets about ourselves. But I think freedom from the fear of our identity coming out and our identity being known and people knowing stuff about us that's really important is not a viable way forward. We need to feel comfortable with our identity and able to be ourselves. So supervision kind of quite often doesn't include disclosure, so literature kind of looks at that, and quite often it's about the kind of mistakes people might make. They may not want to disclose that. Immediacy effects and what happens when we kind of share something about our own intimate thoughts and feelings in a session, and about personal issues that might be going on for an individual that we wouldn't necessarily want to share with the supervisor. And often it's because of shame, we're worried about how people might react, but also there could be a bit of a collusion with supervisee avoidance. So if the supervisee doesn't want to talk about something, a supervisor might also not want to push them on it and make it kind of a difficult kind of topic to bring up. So again, I think the quality of the relationship here is really important. How well you get on with your supervisor, how understood and contained you feel, can help you feel more able to disclose in that context. And once that feels more comfortable, then actually the insecurities we might hold about ourselves can be put to rest a little bit and make it feel more easy to be ourselves in therapy with other individuals. So as I said, most therapists disclose, but rank it as one of the more infrequent approaches. Psychodynamically oriented therapists generally disclose less than others. And interestingly, novice therapists disclose least often, although this increases with experience. And Margaret Gibson wrote about the idea that it might be most helpful when disclosure talks about similarities between individuals, but actually talking about differences can be helpful as well, and differences in perception can help kind of think about ways of approaching a problem differently or challenging and helpful thinking. So some has done some research looking at actually how do people rate therapeutic encounters when disclosures have been used. And 155 people rated vignettes, where people checked in as having similar problems to their clients. And those disclosing were rated as having more positive personal qualities, more likely to form a good relationship and to be successful in therapy. Furthermore, there are some caveats though. It might be a useful technique, but there are some things to bear in mind. Meyer and Hayes asked observers for individual sessions to rate encounters where disclosure was used and where it wasn't used, and they found that people rated less intimate links between the therapist and client's experiences more highly than absent disclosure, so when there was no disclosure, or more intimate connections when the relationship was strong. So again, it's not talking about really deep, kind of dark personal disclosures about our own insecurities, but being able to chime with the person in the room and actually offer some reassurance and some support. And Knox and Hill kind of talk about disclosures of immediacy being most valuable, so what's going through my mind as I'm hearing somebody say what they're experiencing. So this is quite a nice quote, the kind of idea that the human endeavour of therapy finds much meaning in just such fallibility. So actually, there's a quote in a book called Impressive Depressives, which is a really lovely book that I got from the Bethlehem Library. I'm not sure where else it's available. But it looks at kind of people throughout history who've been kind of often posthumously kind of diagnosed as having bipolar disorder. And it talks about the idea that there's more wisdom in a cracked pot than a whole one. So actually, if we have our own personal experience, it can be something that makes us kind of move on to a certain point and gives us a particular direction and perhaps passion in our own careers. A lot of the research I've talked about has limitations. They're often based on vignettes and self-report. Quite often there's not really a lot of information about the level of disclosure that's been used or actually what's been said. And actually lots of kind of factors obviously to bear in mind, that the degree of similarity or difference between the person's disclosure and the therapy's experiences. And also limited research on socio-cultural factors. So there's some evidence of an effect actually in some American research, which shows that Mexican-American clients preferred encounters where there's no disclosure, whereas African-American clients preferred it to be used. I suppose this is just thinking about, in psychology, a whole list of things that might kind of be areas we want to tackle. And I guess one thing that's quite embarrassing about the list is that most of it's like unique to human beings and the two-legged inhabitants of our planet. So I won't kind of read through them all, but there's a lot of things that are potentially wrong with the planet and a lot of things that we could do well to kind of address. And maybe thinking about ourselves, about suffering and about pain and distress differently might open up some conversations we can help those areas become less of a controlling factor. So this is a kind of real example of how the social can actually become located in the individual. So it's kind of really thinking about one particular case. This actual case is a word I hate, but it gets used quite a lot in stuff after the more DRI work, so it's hard not to be effective with that terminology. But a fairly typical presentation to our psychosis services. And I guess some questions to bear in mind then, is this problem the individuals or is it society? Is this something that kind of, where can we hold responsibility for it? Who should be, what can we do to find a way out of this maze? And the answer quite often is to have to become a bit of a superhero. I often think of a mental health issue as not necessarily being a sign of weakness, but actually just a sign that you need to find incalculable strength to deal with a particular difficulty. But I guess in terms of the way people might stigmatise, people might form societies which actually do marginalise people, quite often there's a whole kind of sense of crowd psychology. It's very difficult to stand out from the rest and kind of not go along with the kind of norm of people, with what everyone else is doing. And I guess some of the people that have studied psychology for a long time might be aware of groupthink, the idea that groups will have more polemic, kind of extreme views about things than individuals would have on their own. And this has caused some huge kind of debacles in the past. I think the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba, for example, is one kind of example where the groupthink was said to be quite responsible for causing a bit of a catastrophe. So why psychologists? Why should we be thinking about this? Well, we have quite a lot of training in power balances, thinking about equality and difference. And actually, we're quite highly trained in the recovery model, so the idea that as well as symptom reduction, we're wanting to have a holistic approach to help people particularly valued lives, having things available in their lives to them that have meaning for them. So it may not be just about hearing fewer voices, but it may be about being a good mum or being able to play the guitar. And I guess psychologists are also quite keen to get involved in involvement and tend to kind of champion these things within the services they work in. And I think quite often it's because of the political stance from which we come when we're wanting to think about inclusion and equality, and quite often because we have our own kind of sense of injustice, which I guess all of us represented here today have thought about to some degree to get us kind of to meet together. So in terms of what psychologists are actually like, the Myers-Briggs typology is much derided by people actually, but my MSc in occupational psychology kind of led me to be quite highly and expensively trained in it, and I haven't really used it, so I thought I'd save it for today. So it's thinking about kind of Jungian types, so the idea that our approach to things is based on how we tend to judge and perceive information, and it gives you a kind of 4-letter code, so with 2 variations on each. So you can either be an introvert or extrovert, depending on whether you get your energy from yourself or other people. An intuitive or a sensor, depending on whether you go by basic information or interpretations of information. Thinking or feeling, so based on whether we tune into logic or emotion when they come into an understanding. And judging or perceiving, so whether we prefer to have an absolute definite conclusion that we come to, or whether we like to kind of remain a bit more open to it. So interestingly, most psychologists come out as extroverts, intuitive, feeling, perceivers. I dissent from that. I'm an ENTP, and it's a bit of disclosure. And I think it just kind of goes to show that actually with all those typologies, they're relatively evenly spread, so about kind of 15-20% of kind of people fall into each of the categories. Other issues that psychologists tend to suffer from are perfectionism, so that sense that we'll only accept or kind of deliver the best. And I think that follows us through quite often in our careers. We feel we need to kind of promote that and to be somebody who is actually delivering the best at all times. And I think with that pressure on our backs to actually kind of fulfil that role, it can make it very difficult to own any vulnerabilities. We quite often have a rescuer schema, so a kind of a rescue idea that we have to kind of dive in and save the day for everybody, and this is quite often kind of contrasted with the imposter syndrome, which people might be familiar with, that sense that actually I'm a really small fish in a really big pond, I've cut myself out a really huge task to be facing in life, and actually I'm never going to be up to it. And I think all of this just really kind of goes to show that psychologists also have issues. Kind of studying psychology doesn't protect us from having a mental health problem, doesn't necessarily cure us, but it could be a way of us using our own personal experience of distress or psychological distress in a positive way. So I'm going to skip forward to a few slides because this is quite an interesting one actually. Many people wanting to reach out and connect with other people in therapy and to not feel misunderstood or to have connections with people that are going to be able to understand them. And actually social networking is starting to be set up to support people to meet each other, and quite often people want to meet other people that are going to understand them and have a sense of kind of who they are. So human beings have a lot of potential. We can live in different environments, we can show compassion, we can pull together in tragedies like Charlie Hebdo experience has demonstrated, but often depression, a huge barrier, kind of gets in the way, and as a task to overcome it, something that we can all galvanise our actions to try and reduce. Actually, just thinking who's a psychologist, to get through our day, all of us make judgments, we predict behaviour, we manage our reactions based on what we think they might be perceived as, and we spend a lot of time trying to understand our emotions and others. And I think parents are particularly well placed to do this because we're always trying to predict or maintain or encourage or dissuade kind of particular behaviours. I think that means quite a lot of thinking about how a particular experience might be understood, how it might affect the child that we're kind of trying desperately to bring up. What I did want to talk about, I have to skip to the end. When I was thinking about actually people that have used mental health services and have become psychologists and worked in the the NHS, I kind of couldn't help but think of Rufus May, who I can't do his voice, so I won't be able to do a very good impression of him. But I did ask his opinion on kind of what his thoughts were about people with mental health issues kind of being underrepresented in psychology. We know people are working in psychology and have mental health issues, but people often find it quite difficult to come out and be open about it. And I guess my rather kind of winding talk today, because my slides are completely in a different order for which I remember them. I suppose I was just asking him what he kind of thought about that difficulty. Why is it so difficult for us to talk about these things when we can disclose many other things, to talk about things that are very powerful and difficult in very convincing ways? So Rufus was a psychologist who had psychosis and trained in UEL. He chose not to divulge it to his services until after training. And his thoughts on why people tend not to kind of disclose were that clinical psychology, the health profession, its roots are in psychological testing. At its inception, psychologists like Hans Eysenck thought therapy was not scientific enough for clinical psychologists. So there's a history of posing as objective scientist practitioners, applying psychological theory to behaviour. So being open about one's sensitivity or vulnerability or irrational experiences is difficult in this context, where being a rational expert of the mind and behaviour seems to be encouraged. So to be open is a challenge in this profession. It's probably not a good career move, as in my experience at least, it rocks the boat. There's a culture in the NHS of being compartmentalised and fitting into the hierarchy, not challenging convention. The more people are open, the easier it will become, but the fact people are not doing so suggests there are big systemic obstacles into this process. Rufus would like to see a way where a lot more experiential training, so training where people are encouraged to find safe ways to talk about their own experiences, is occurring, and he's encouraged by the growth of mindfulness influenced approaches. He says he's also found many younger psychologists seem to be more open-minded about being more open, but not sure about how representative that is. So really just ending a kind of note echoing somebody else's comments, that actually when we come into the profession of clinical psychology, we want to make things better, and actually rather than thinking about how we can take psychology out of the therapy room and how we can kind of achieve all these great things out in the world, it might be helpful for us to think about what's happening within our profession also and apply psychology to the psychologists. So thank you for bearing with me during my slightly breathless wander through some very confusing slides, for me as well as for you, I'm sure. Thank you for bearing with me.